Thanks, Paul, for joining today. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a chat. So, welcome.
Happy to be here. Thanks for asking me.
So you are, you work at Denison University, is that right, in
I
Ohio?
do. Yeah,
And
Central Ohio. That's right.
how are you finding that? Do you like it working there?
I do. It's an excellent college, and we have wonderful students to work with, and I get some freedom to work on my research, and so it's a great combination for me.
Yeah. So your area of research, really, you're a political scientist, but I guess you specialize really talking about religion and politics and where the two kind of come together and all those kind of facets. So what is it that got you interested in that, particular subject?
Well, my joke is that I have nothing to say at dinner parties because of what I specialize in. So maybe it's a
Yeah.
defense mechanism for introverts.
Oh, it's hilarious. Yeah, no, it's so true, because I mean, people just put these categories and say you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that, but what is there anything left to talk about?
Yeah, right.
You'll never
Well,
get the
these
facts
days,
otherwise.
religion and politics really seems to infuse almost everything, including pandemic politics and everything in between. So I find that we almost can't escape it. But to get back to your original question, the thing that really got me interested, well, there's a number of things, but my family has quite a bit of religion in it, and my grandfather was a pastor, and several of my uncles are pastors, and on the other side, on my dad's side, there was at least one that founded a church community in a small town in very rural Michigan, and so there was quite a lot of religion, but it really didn't take in me. My uncle joked that I wasn't held under the baptismal fount long enough.
Yep,
And
not
so,
just
yeah,
didn't get enough coverage. They say,
right,
some people
right.
say if there's a toe that doesn't get baptized, then it doesn't count.
Well, it was probably more than that in my case, but so there was, at some point you sort of want to understand where you came from and what it all sort of means, and in college that kind of came home for me. But also had some really excellent professors, one in particular in college, my undergraduate institution, that studied religion and politics, and I thought it was fascinating. And it was also the last kind of way I think about it is, it was a really wonderful place for me to study social influence. I think of congregations as kind of tiny societies that have leaders and followers and beliefs and values and all sorts of interesting social dynamics. So I tend to approach religion and politics in some ways as thinking about as an analogy for the way that society works as
A
well.
microcosm as such.
Yeah, exactly right.
And it's interesting. I mean, you said there about pandemic politics. You see religion in that somehow. Is that can you see all the places that, I know there's the more obvious ways that you might see religion getting involved in American politics, particularly, but I guess to the innocent bystander, you might not see religion playing a part in pandemic politics. So from this, then, can you see influences of religion that maybe others might miss if they didn't look hard enough?
Absolutely. In fact, we just published a piece in a journal about the role of the prosperity gospel in shaping reactions to the way that the American states tried to intervene, and public health measures and all sorts of things. You can see
Wow.
that. So there's a lot of things to unpack there that we might talk about a little bit. It's quite a loaded sentence.
Absolutely.
But just first to think about what the prosperity gospel is. These are folks that are taught and then believe that if they express enough belief in God, that they'll return back both health and wealth and other things that they might desire. So there's really tangible, physical kinds of returns to religious belief here on earth.
Yes.
And so that plays out. Obviously, if health is a component of that, then you would see that say if a doctor is trying to intervene and say that you need to do something like wear a mask or distance yourself from others, that some of these believers might say, no, my faith is sufficient. I just believe in Jesus, and he's going to take care of me. In fact, there was a really interesting little clip on CNN here in the United States where a woman was headed off. This was after my state of Ohio was closed down. We were told to stay at home and not go out and avoid gatherings of more than 6 people. Anyway, she was going to a very large church gathering, and when interviewed said, no, I'm covered by the blood of Jesus. I'm going to go, and
Yeah.
that's going to protect me from the coronavirus. And so that kind of belief is pretty widespread. There's a lot of Americans that believe that they're going to get tangible material benefits from their religious belief. And of course, because of the nature of, you need a coordinated response to beat back the coronavirus, which the US has proven itself incapable of doing. And part of that has to be religious belief, given the way that it's played out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to be upfront. I'm looking at things. I guess I am a Christian myself. I see things through that lens. But to me, it's disturbing in ways to see, I guess, how things are misinterpreted as, it's you don't get this protective cover, invisible protective covering necessarily from things like viruses. That's not a given. And I understand absolutely, people praying for protection from those sorts of things, but if you don't take the basic steps, you would think that even religious people might assume that God's kind of face palming a little bit whenever he sees you, just not taking the basic precautions. And to me, like it's definitely interesting things. I was sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, one of the things that I'm really interested to study here, and I have a couple of grants trying to get some money to do some more surveys, is to see if some of these beliefs have taken a hit because of the coronavirus. So there's lots of congregations that stayed open, and of course, a lot of the hot spots that have popped up in the United States have been congregations, choirs and this sort of thing that just it rapidly spreads. So, even those that espoused a prosperity gospel view really pivoted quickly once, their congregation or they themselves were hit by the virus.
Okay,
So I wonder if,
people,
over the past couple of months, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, people seeing then the effect on their congregation, they've then come to the realization of the seriousness, you would say, or is that what's sort of coming to light? Because I wasn't sure if people would then double down and be more.
Right.
But I guess it's when you see people getting sick and even getting hospitalized, of course it'll bring it home. But part of me wondered, if you've gone that far, will you just sort of go completely down the road until oh well, it'll get them, but it'll not get me.
Right. Well, these are great hypotheses, and hopefully I get to be able to test them in the next couple of months. But it's we just don't get these kind of opportunities very much where everybody's responding to the same thing. And, the kind of intervention here of the virus really cuts through these beliefs. It just doesn't spare anybody if you're exposed to it. So, it's a terrible time for the world, and especially right now for the United States, but also for social scientists, it's an unparalleled opportunity to study some of these things. They're all on the surface.
That's a scenario that only comes around. I think it'll come around more often in the next century than the last. But sometimes it can only come along once in a century. These kind of
let's hope that it's a one in a century. But I think crossed. You're right. I think it's going to be more common.
Well, I saw that article. It was on the BBC yesterday. I don't know how the coverage in the USA, but they've already found the next potential.
I saw that.
And
right.
I mean, unless something's done about this, how these originate, and I don't know whether it's the markets or the meat, but whatever's happening in China seems to be, causing, it's almost incubating these terrible viruses and diseases. And like, unless you deal with the root cause, like it's going to happen more and more often.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, we need to maintain our international institutions that are continuing to do research in places where these are likely to pop up. So at least we know it's coming and can start to plan for it. But you're right. There's probably some world conditions and that probably can be addressed. I'm not ready to go for the conspiracy theory quite yet. That somebody's behind it.
Yeah.
But
a few more cases and you'll start to doubt. Yeah, if it happens every couple of years. So assume you were kind of hinting there at the World Health Organization, and I suppose the president's had his own views on that. And I mean, to me, some are understandable concerns in terms of holding people to account, but I mean, I guess you can draw parallels to church culture somehow in this, in that there's often a lot of some people will just sort of jump off the ship and say, right, well, we're not taking part. You're not taking care of us, so we don't want no part of it, rather than perhaps staying for the reform. And I guess maybe that's it sort of represents a consumeristic culture of today, that where if something's not serving your immediate needs, then it's deemed not worthy of any attention. But I assume you have views then on how the president has reacted, you know, especially
Well, in theory, I think you're right. I mean, they're holding members accountable seems like a good idea, and making sure everybody contributes and that sort of thing. The United States has really helped push some international organizations and been a large backer for a long time, and it obviously suits all of our needs to do that. And I think because the United States is a pretty wealthy nation, that it should contribute more probably than others do, especially because of our impact, the United States' impact on the world in terms of trade and lots of other things, good and bad. I have pretty strong views about what the president has done, and I think it's disastrous. I don't think that many of these decisions, whether it's his talk about NATO or the WHO or what have you, is really grounded much in evidence, but really in just these kind of gut feelings. And strange too that he's going after these cooperative institutions that the United States was involved in founding, and then being soft on who our former enemies or competitors, strong competitors were. That's it's really difficult to take, but there's an election soon, and hopefully the United States goes a different direction and starts to rebuild some of these things. I don't know that has much to do with religion.
Nope.
Aside from the fact that I think some would rather have more insulation from these kind of broader institutions than cooperation and deference and working with. There's that sort of insulation that's provided from not having to work with others, so you can just maintain your beliefs and without real consequence.
Yeah, so it's fair to say then that you probably won't be voting for the president come the next election then.
Well, I mean, I'll keep that one to myself, but
I tried to trip you up there.
I follow the evidence where it needs to go. That sometimes is, in favor of religion, and sometimes it makes religion look a little bit bad. And, I just follow the evidence wherever it might go.
Yeah. And I mean, it's been a trying time for people, well, everyone across the world, but I mean, especially I guess in the faith community, and Christians it seems they're having a real tough time. One of the things that inspired me to start this series of podcasts was issues such as the president holding up the Bible. Things like this are dividing Christians in a way that I don't think I've ever seen. Well, at least in my lifetime. I'm only 23. I've only seen a handful of presidents, but it's dividing Christians in a way that perhaps I didn't see this kind of division over many things that Obama did, other than I guess the obvious faith issues of gay rights and abortion and things like that. But Christians were more unified on the whole against, they had a more cohesive opinion on those issues, whereas a lot of things Donald Trump does seems to split people right down the middle. Is that what your research is finding, that he's dividing the religious types, or do you find that no matter what he does, more people are actually standing with him no matter what?
Yeah, it's pretty complex, and there's a lot going on there. And I would say first that Donald Trump is really a fullest expression of the divisions, partly among Christians, but in American society, that's been developing for a very long time. And so part of that is the split into kind of a conservative camp and a liberal camp. That I was just reading about the decline of denominationalism in the United States. And so United States used to be divided Protestant versus Catholic versus Jew. And eventually some of those divisions started to melt, so that the divisions really were a conservative camp that had Christians and Protestants and Catholics and Jews and whoever happened to be in that camp, versus a liberal set that had Catholics and it had Protestants and others.
Is this more as the primary thing that's dividing people? And people obviously still have these identities and labels they'll go by, but as in, would you say then politics now in terms of conservative liberal is becoming the main thing that people are divided by, rather than religious things? Is that what you're trying to say then, in terms of politics is the main?
That's where I'm driving. Yeah, is that it's really kind of collapsed into, if there's two kind of primary camps within religion, American religion, those pretty easily mapped onto the political party system. And so you have Republicans who are fairly dyed in the wool, and the same thing with Democrats. And they tend to eschew anything that's associated with the other party. There's not a lot of inter-party dialogue, people willing to switch parties
Mm-hmm.
at this point. So Donald Trump is really a full expression of that, and of course exploits it
Yeah.
at every opportune moment. So I take issue a little bit with saying that this division is new, and I don't think that there was a lot of unity, even looking back at Barack Obama's presidency
Mm-hmm.
or before that. I mean, those divisions were quite deep at that point,
Mm-hmm.
and fairly polarized about some of those issues that you're mentioning about abortion and gay rights and other things. But the other thing that was really important in Obama's tenure, of course, was the politics of race. And I think that American religion is deeply divided about the politics of race too. At this point, for instance, just did some research about whether people believe that Donald Trump is anointed by God to be
Yes, I
president.
read a little bit. I think there was an article on your website or one of the links you had, and I read a little
Yeah.
bit of your write up. But if you wouldn't mind then explaining sort of some of the findings that you were getting from that.
Yeah, sure. So not that long ago, this was last year, early last year, 2019, some political leaders started to use this language that Donald Trump was anointed by God to be president, had a special role to play, was perhaps a modern incarnation of King Cyrus, who was not Christian, but was chosen by God in their estimation to help Christians, to protect Christians. So anyway, there was a number of different ways of conceptualizing this, but the idea was that God had chosen Donald Trump, perhaps the imperfect vessel that he was, but he was here to protect Christians against a growing threat. So people like the former governor Rick Perry were using this. Paula White, who's a very famous Pentecostal preacher, she has her own TV show, very large congregation in Florida. She was using this language, and others were, and so we were really curious if this was starting to penetrate into the public. In early 2019, we found about 20% of Americans and about 50% of Pentecostal believers thought that he was anointed by God. And we did the survey again in 2020 and found that had really increased. So upwards of 50% of frequently attending believers of any kind believe that Donald Trump was anointed by God. We also asked if all presidents were anointed by God, because the general idea here is that they believe that God is active in the world, that everything is flowing according to God's plan, God is in charge, this sort of thing. And that, of course, logically means that all presidents are part of God's plan. But it was much lower when we suggested that Barack Obama was anointed too. So part of that's party, but the other part is difficulty swallowing that a black man could be anointed by God to be their president. So
Okay, so you think race played a part in that anointing?
quite a bit.
Okay.
Quite a bit. There's a variety of new books that are coming out. One by Robbie Jones of PRRI. If you can, I think you should check that out. It should be out pretty soon. But just talking about the deep racial divisions that have been in place in American religion over a very long time now.
Okay,
and so that continues to play out now.
Yeah, I would have thought. I mean, I guess not being an American, I don't know as much as someone that's steeped in that culture, but I would have assumed the opposition to Obama, as well as race, which may have played a part. I would have assumed that it would have been on political grounds, and I've heard a lot of people at the time saying, "Oh, that's the Westboro Baptist Church kind of thing of Obama's the Antichrist, and he's come to ruin America. He's come, he's going to seek a third term, and then we'll know he's, So these are the things that were coming out. But then, I guess, you don't hear the same people then coming out against anything that Donald Trump has done. That's, you could argue a lot of things he's done are very much against biblical values. So it's definitely, I mean, it's an interesting thought to think that race would have played more of a part than I would have assumed in that. It's definitely an interesting thought. I wouldn't have assumed that race would have had as big an impact as you were saying.
Well, you can pivot and think about really any sort of minority group or unrepresented group in politics. And so one interesting little anecdote that's popping up now is if you go to Trump rallies, you'll find plenty of paraphernalia, T-shirts and hats and flags and whatever that still references Hillary Clinton. But almost none of it at this point talks about Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And what's part of it is probably just a overstock. They have a lot of things that they need to move still
Yeah.
before they pivot. But perhaps the other side of this too is that Joe Biden's a white guy, and Hillary Clinton was not a white guy. And certainly Barack Obama is not a white guy. So
Yeah.
um,
I mean, I definitely, like, I understand the dilemma that was presented at the last election, not necessarily on, I mean, to me, it wouldn't have mattered if the race or gender of any of the candidates. But I think for sure, like, in my opinion, the Americans were presented with uh, two options that had their cons in different places, and there was definitely, I mean, I know that my wife's family and people around had a decision to make in terms of who was the least worst candidate, and this is something you hear very often. And I guess in this election as well, you're seeing from a lot of people, a similar problem where who's the least worst? Is it Joe Biden, who, just from the virtue of being old, is having, difficulty in some times keeping up with the pace, and then you've got Donald Trump with his obvious flaws. So would you see that, especially in the church community, are the majority, in your opinion, blind followers of Donald Trump, or are they maybe least worst types where they're picking Trump over because of the policy agenda perhaps that he might have?
No, this is the frequent refrain, is that they pick Donald Trump because of abortion and judges. So because he was pro-life, and because he was going to pick judges that were also pro-life and had this strict kind of sense of what the Constitution would permit, that they were going to go with someone who was a flawed vessel. But there's a couple of things that lead me to sort of reject that view, that it was really just the kind of holding their nose and voting for something they otherwise wouldn't choose. And one is that when you ask them if they liked Donald Trump, they did, and they feel quite warmly toward Donald Trump.
Okay.
He gets very high kind of warmth ratings from evangelical Christians. And so that's one thing. And, if they were really holding their nose, they could say, I really don't like this guy, but I'm going to support him anyway. And that's not what they're doing. And the other one is the degree to which they've really changed some core values in order to support Donald Trump. And so it's one of the more dramatic changes I've seen in polling over a fairly short period of time. So 2011, Americans were asked if a politician who has committed immoral acts in their personal life could be ethical in their public behavior. So could they still be a good public servant effectively, even though they've been immoral in their personal life? And so there was no, at 2011, there was no sense that this is about Donald Trump. This was about something else. And evangelical Christians were the strongest adherents against that vision.
As you would assume, yeah.
As you would assume. That's kind of the core of what they're about. You have to be pure in your heart in order to be, a good citizen, right? It comes from the inside out. By 2016, they were the most fervent adopters of that view.
The people who had changed the most.
They went to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It was something like 20% in support in 2011 to like 60 or 70% in support in 2016.
Is the change in that, do you think, due to the charisma, as you might say, of Donald Trump, or is it for other reasons? What would cause such a drastic change? Is there an element of nose holding, whereas they're just unwilling to admit that they were, that maybe they said, I would never vote for anyone like that, but now they feel a bit sheepish about saying, well, okay, well, I've kind of had to do it, but now I'm just going to, come out in full support. What?
I suppose. I mean, I would just, it's at least one really long older observer of evangelicals. He was studying them in his entire life. Once he saw this result, he said, I don't know anything about this group anymore. I mean, this is the thing for somebody that studies religion and politics. You say, well, there's some core values and everything else emanates from that. And that's kind of the point of studying religion and politics, is that, you can study these things and therefore gain a rational understanding of.
You get to know the groups you're studying.
Yeah, exactly right. So, none of us expected to see this kind of turn. And I think you have to go to the kinds of explanations that you're offering, which is to think that, you know, this is an internal defense mechanism that I made this decision. Maybe I'm ashamed of it, who knows, but I need to find some kind of way to justify it and protect myself from that kind of scrutiny. So perhaps this is that sort of thing. But to see that kind of rejection of what was understood to be at the core of a belief system is just incredible.
Well, yeah, from a Christian perspective, you know, we talk about in the church your witness being everything, and when you say about you would think that Christians would demand more, because this notion of witness in terms of how the world sees you reflecting your faith, you know, and in terms of you have to be an ambassador for your religion to the world, you would assume that in those evangelical groups that would be one of the key issues. I mean, even ahead of the policies, you know, that they may be in favor of, you would think, you know, and I guess that was part of the argument against Hillary Clinton in terms of she's corrupt, she's this, she's that, and the other. And it's very interesting to see the research that evangelicals largely, you know, abandoned that sort of idea. And I mean, to me, that it just, I would assume that this is to do with pride, and but then part of me as well wonders just how many people were actually, is there like a brainwashing, is there a sort of cultish feel of people that are just, you know, have been taken in by this culture of Trump the person. And it's definitely understandable. He's got a great charisma about him, more so than other candidates have had, not necessarily in terms of, I'm not saying great in terms of his politics, but in terms of actually engaging the audience. I was listening to, I think it was, are you familiar with Jimmy Dore and the Jimmy Dore Show?
I think I've heard of it, but I don't know.
So he's a YouTuber. He would be a left wing, fairly fervent sort of Bernie Sanders supporting type commentator, but he almost lost my train of thought there. Sorry, they were saying that if you go to a Donald Trump rally, I'm pretty sure it was him, and maybe when he was on the Joe Rogan show, but they're talking about the rallies being like stand-up shows in some ways, and they're engaging people in a way that hasn't, because it's funny, and it's, you know, whether you agree or not, it's a funny and I just wonder how many people have been taken in. What's the percentage of people that have been taken in and bought in fully to that, and how many people, you know, that would be my question. How many are actually the nose holders? And I guess it's hard to people might say in 4 years' time, when history looks less kindly, perhaps, or in a year's time when if he's elected, you know, someone else is elected, they may, you know, be, I only voted for him because, you know, I just had to do it. But then, you know, if perhaps history looked kinder on it, they'd be like, yeah, I was in all along. You know, I just wonder what that breakdown would be like.
That'd be really interesting to see. There's always that winner's bias in polls taken after the election, of more people saying that they voted for the winner than the loser. So that's interesting. And you know, it's there's bits of evidence of what you're talking about. So for instance, his idea of drain the swamp, which he talked about a lot in the 2016 election, apparently he kind of came up with on the spot in one of his rallies, and he got a great reaction from it. And so he kept using it. And, you know, it wasn't necessarily apparently something that he really planned out, but just kind of rolled with it because, you know, he got a good reaction.
And that's that sort of comedian sort of aspect in terms of, you know, they'll repeat what works with the crowds. And I guess I wonder, is that, I'm sure he could have built his policy on what went well. And you're not going to catch me sort of comparing Trump with Hitler, but that is something I know that the Nazi Party did as well. Hitler would make notes on things, and I'm saying this purely in the perspective of two people that were engaging speakers. You know, they would make notes of what worked well and what resonated. And it
seems like a basic element of populism.
Yeah, well, exactly. On the populist side of things, if you want to represent the people, you know, that would be a completely valid thing to do, to see what resonates with people, and I have no objection to him building his policy on that. But I would have thought, or I would have had a lot more faith, perhaps, in Christians, you know, that they would actually be able to separate, you know, this aspect of an engaging speaker that disagrees with what you believe, and someone who's less engaging but agrees. You know, I thought more people would have sided with the people they actually agreed with.
This is a classic notion of evangelicals, is that they're embattled and they have this distance from the culture. The culture is something that you should really keep at arm's length. And political figures would seem to be a kind of, a core representation of where the culture is, right? Is not necessarily something that you can trust. So it's really interesting to see evangelical elites, Christian right elites, and others. Not that those are really the same thing, but coming out and offering some very spirited defenses of the president, of trying to figure out ways to say that he's a baby Christian, that he's learning, that he.
Yeah, I've had this discussion with people. We were talking about really the Bible holding scene, and I had a number of Christian friends who came out and kind of would post things on Facebook such as this man represents nothing of the Bible that I know. He's not a representation. I can't I can't go along with this brand of Christianity. And I was surprised actually how many people agreed with that sentiment. But I'm naturally, in me, I think, as a Christian, is it more effective? I just didn't like the kind of throwing him under the bus aspect. And that's not to say that Trump would represent Christianity in my eyes either. But it's interesting to think, if it was any other believer, you would kind of take them at face value. If they say, I believe in God, you would sort of be like, oh, that's okay. But then because he's in such this spotlight's on him, really, everything that he does, people are saying, I can't stand with this. He doesn't represent me. But I guess that's to me, I just didn't like the kind of how nasty that kind of approach was in terms of he's not one of us. And it's interesting that Trump it's a dilemma for Christians because he does claim to be a Christian, but you wouldn't have, I don't think he claims to be, he claims that he's a believer, he claims these things, but there's such a dilemma in terms of he does a lot of things that the Christians don't like, and it's such, it's just, I guess everyone has to make up their own minds about the sincerity of someone who says that. But would you ever see then, in terms of the church and Republicans, evangelicals who identify as Republicans, do you ever think there would be a split? I've read some things you've written about the terms used was a crack up in terms of the Republicans perhaps separating or church evangelical types, perhaps leaving him. Do you think there's a line he could cross where people would then think, right, that's enough, there's going to be a separation here?
No. Categorical. I really don't think so. We media headlines keep talking about his support dropping, and then when you look at his approval rating, it's at the lower end maybe of where it has been in his presidency, but it's still at about 40%, which is where it started, and it hasn't changed. I think in the 2020 election, he's going to get 3/4 of the evangelical vote or more. So he's going to get really about the same proportion of evangelicals that he got in 2016. I really don't think anything's going to change, but I think there's a couple things to kind of work through here. And one of them is just the degree of threat that evangelicals are feeling at this point. And you can see that especially from the recent ruling from the Supreme Court that outlawed discrimination against LGBT Americans.
Yes, and trans Americans as well, wasn't it?
That's right. This was not something that they expected to be written by a Trump justice appointee. And so it was, frankly, shocking to me as well. I did not expect that.
Was that Gorsuch that wrote the majority opinion on that, or which one?
That's correct. Yeah. So he was pitched as someone that evangelicals would be really proud of, that he was going to take a stand against the encroachment of the LGBT special agenda, as they would call it. But so they had a major setback in that regard, and I think they see that as a real threat. And they were saying things like, well, I guess religious freedom is over in America. That's the degree of threat that they're feeling at this point, that they're really under pressure, that they're not going to be able to express their views and, frankly, continue to discriminate against LGBT Americans.
I can understand some of the, to me, freedom of speech is a really important issue, but not when it, not from the perspective, I don't want freedom of speech when it only helps me and doesn't help anyone else. So, I can understand how some people might feel like they're sort of, these claws are sinking in or whatever, but then also there might be things that perhaps the evangelical agenda might seek to do that would limit the expression of others, so I don't
Yeah.
like when there's this it's fine when it helps me, but not when it helps other communities and other
No,
people
it's
that
a
I don't
thorny
agree.
it's a thorny question, to be sure. Most Americans do support religious freedom. They want to see people have conscience rights,
Yes.
and they also don't want to see people be discriminated against. In fact, most Americans actually thought that there were protections for LGBT Americans in place. So they didn't know
You
that
would assume.
it wasn't
Yeah.
happening in many states. But that's only one small part of it. There are many folks, including the president, who have said in public that if Democrats are elected, they're going to persecute Christians, that they're going to ban the Bible. They're going to take away your right to run for office, to speak however you want. I mean, they're really going to strip you for your First Amendment rights. And there's a lot of Americans that actually believe this to be true. And so once you start from that kind of place, then you can justify all kinds of things. It doesn't matter what imperfect a vessel you choose. You need to choose whatever weapon is in front of you. And
The end
in fact,
justifies the means. Yeah.
Yeah, if it's a bully like Trump appears to be, so much the better, because at least he's on your side and fighting for your cause. And so that kind of brings us back to him holding the Bible out next to the church right outside of the White House. Presidents have frequently used biblical imagery in times of crisis, but they use it in entirely different ways than this president has. They reach out and they use very general terms, inclusive terms, comforting terms, that God is in control and he's going to bring us together and bring us.
It was a strange gesture for sure.
It's holding up a sword. I mean, this is like, I'm here. I'm still here with this Bible. I'm going to protect you against the invading hordes.
And it's an appealing notion. I can understand this for a lot of people, especially if this is something that's that you're getting fed perhaps day by day. I don't know whether this sort of leads into, are people getting both sides of, are they exposing themselves to different opinions often enough? But if people are getting fed this idea of we're under siege, then it would be reasonable to see them react favorably to someone who's fighting for them, whether they don't look perfect. So I mean, it was a very strange situation. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it, but I don't even know.
We
what
haven't
to
either.
Think, I don't even know what to think. It's one of those things, you just see it and you just think this is it. I mean, the word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot, but I guess it is unprecedented in terms of he just kind of held it up and walked away. There wasn't those words. And I mean, when I saw the press conference before that, I thought, right, well, here comes Donald Trump's going to go here and make a speech perhaps about how, I'm here for law and order. I love that you are protesting, but perhaps, I'm also going to stand up for the police in this situation. I thought there was going to be some words of perhaps trying to stitch that wound a little bit, but it was kind of just walk over, hold, and then leave, and that would have been a perfect, I mean, I don't know. I just think that if I was involved in his staff, that would have been such a great image really for him to have perhaps approached the church staff that were working with the protesters, for him to be seen to go there to meet with the people, that would have helped his image a lot more, I would have thought, than kind of walk, hold, go, but it's, I don't know, I guess it's just for the photo, but it's appealing to the base.
It seems easy. This is a time where you offer some platitudes about racial reconciliation and coming together as one in a country to make some progress and let people interpret that as they will. But that's not the game that he's playing, clearly. And maybe his staff wanted to do that, but he clearly shows that he's willing to go his own way. So that picture did send, I think, a very strong signal, and some liked that signal and many really did not like that signal. And kind of all the build up to get to that photo op really struck people the wrong way. But many really thought, like, this is who he is, and he's standing up for our side, and that Bible really stands for kind of the white Christian community at this point, even though obviously it's not exclusive to them.
No. So you don't think to come back to that, you don't think there's a line that he could cross from your research or opinion that would sort of drive away Christian support? Is there a line? If he came out, perhaps he said, just say for example, he said, gay marriage, that this is something that maybe should be on the cards. Let's just say that came out. Do you think that would?
He did say that back in the 2016 election, that he was going to protect gay rights. He hasn't really supported
Yeah.
that during his administration, and it didn't seem to turn many away
Mm-hmm.
in 2016. We've tried to push in a couple of different directions. Like just before the election, we did an experiment where we gave people a snippet of an op-ed, and it was a sort of
Mm-hmm.
never Trumper op-ed that said that, frankly, his logic is demonic. This was from an evangelical Christian that
Wow.
saw real dangers in Donald Trump. And so we used some of that language, and the views of Trump dropped a little bit. They dimmed slightly among evangelicals, but not nearly to a place where they would maybe vote for the other side.
Yeah, I think I read something that you'd
bit.
written. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think I read something you'd written where, did you say part of the issue was that if there were evangelical leaders against Donald Trump, the average person perhaps hadn't heard or didn't hear this kind of,
That's right,
backlash.
Yeah, there were evangelicals that were willing to take some kind of middle ground and say, at the very least, we should maintain our distance and some skepticism of who this man is. But they weren't really well known, and people didn't understand the kind of positions that they were taking. So, if you just from a straightforward sort of accumulation of being exposed to these sorts of views, you're hearing much more from evangelicals that we're all in. From leaders that were willing to say, "Hey, this is our vehicle. We're gonna go with this. We're gonna go for it. He may not be perfect, but we like him and we trust him." Or some that were saying, he's a good Christian candidate. So if you're hearing that on a regular basis from people you trust, then why would you question it?
It's a really interesting, like the Donald Trump question for Christians. It's interesting to me to kind of wrap my head around it. I probably would have, I admitted to people, I probably would have in that election voted for Donald Trump because if I was American, because I would have had more faith in his ability to become, because I remember on the night of his election, he came out and he actually made a very good speech about, now's the time to come together, as all people that get elected tend to do. Probably would have had more faith in people in the White House, even the like of Mike Pence, who like him or not dislike him. I thought people like that would have maybe shaped him into the more presidential character. But I don't know if that's exactly panned out the way I would have expected. So, it would be interesting for me to see how, if there's people that were in the same boat as me, would they, perhaps think of switching or even not voting at all. That's the next logical step, that you just don't vote or vote the Republican ticket. And it's an opportunity missed in some ways, that there wasn't a stronger Democratic candidate, in my opinion. Even like I was listening to the like of Tulsi Gabbard or people like that, even Amy Klobuchar. People who are more articulate in their way of speaking, that just didn't quite make the cut. And I think if that could have changed enough minds, perhaps at least people in the middle ground. But it'll be interesting to me to see how this affects the kind of rate of people actually turning out to vote, because I think that's how we might see the backlash or the change, rather than people voting the other way. It'll be the people that just don't show up. No,
I think you're exactly right. So Donald Trump said, tons of polling at this point being done, and the inclination to vote for Trump has actually dropped a little bit over the past few months. But it hasn't gone over to Biden. It's gone over to, I don't know, or I'm not sure. Yeah. So I think you're right that it probably won't go the other side. And there might be a slightly higher rate of evangelicals or others that sit home on election day. But, there's a lot of time between now and then. It's unclear how things are going to go. And, they could get just as riled up. Obviously there's going to be a huge turnout operation on the Republican side to get people to the polls, because they understand this exact problem.
So, the last 3 months feel like 3 years, really, in terms of the campaign. That's where I guess it's all settled. But this is interesting because it's a similar, issue to this idea. I was reading about how you've been doing research on the religious kind of nuns, the people who put down nothing as their religion, and I guess that's similar to how people then politically might just not turn up or not vote, at all. rather than voting for Donald Trump. And you've been doing some work, I guess, on people who have maybe used to identify as Protestant or evangelical Christians that have then now, rather than becoming atheists, they've become kind of, well, I should say, rather than becoming kind of hardline atheists, are more like, I don't know, or I'm not sure. People that are disenfranchised almost from their church because they don't feel like it represents them.
Yeah.
Is that something that's still happening, where this rate of are people still dropping away from the church, or what has your research shown in that regard?
Right. So it really started to trend upward at about 1994, 1995. And what's interesting then is that's when Republicans took control of Congress for the first time in 40 years. And it was kind of the first sort of big showing of the Christian right being, in control and operative in American politics. And that's when the rate of the nuns starts to go up from about 5%. And it kept rising up until about 2018 to maybe 25 to 30%, depending on the polls.
Mm-hmm.
Our most recent read suggests that maybe it's starting to level off. But it all depends. It's just one data point, but that data point wasn't going up like we expected it to keep doing, and it kind of leveled off. So we'll see what 2020 surveys tell us about that rate. But it had just a steady rate of increase all across that period from 1995 to almost 2020. And we found that, politics is really driving people's decisions in church when they disagree politically, especially if they aren't really well connected within the congregation. So if they're not very active, they're not attending very much, then they might use that distance, that political distance, to make a decision to leave the congregation.
Yeah, that was my next question. And that can be, that could be taken at face value for, you would think a lot of things contribute to people dropping away, but in your opinion, then this political link or politics from the pulpit, this is playing a part really in the people leaving?
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a lot of things that can do that. And I think our official position among the co-authors that did that work is that politics is just one of many things that they might use. So they can feel like no one here really kind of represents my interests. Nobody's interested in cycling in this congregation. So why would I stay, what have you? So there's a lot of things that might contribute, but politics is one that's very present and very personal. And so they could use that. In fact, we found that the disagreement over Trump in 2016 drove people out of their churches. So there were some evangelicals that weren't on the Trump train, as we know. And a good number of those folks actually left their congregations as a result. So, it kind of plays out. It's on the left, it's on the right, it's in the center. Politics can be driving people out, kind of no matter where it is. And so, so this is actually something kind of curious. We're talking here, and our conversation is suffused with politics and religion. But we found out that politics wasn't incredibly commonly talked about. And clergy actually weren't talking about Trump that often. So there wasn't really sort of a bunch of platoons out there that were mobilizing the troops to talk about it. And I think it's because of this dynamic that they're really sort of afraid of their congregations falling apart on for political reasons.
Yeah, I've experienced this before. I mean, I would say that in the UK, in my experience, the church as a whole, in terms of their political views, I would say are more liberal than the American evangelical, that more liberal than what their views would be. I see when I think of the church in America, it's very, and I've heard this from different people that have lived there or from there, but, pro-Republican, pro-Israel in some extent, Zionist, kind of these sort of things, these very conservative viewpoints, very anti-abortion, very anti-gay, these are the things that come to mind about the American evangelical political stance. Whereas in my experience in the UK, what I found is that the church tend to have more of a liberal viewpoint. And that was almost, I'm probably someone with more naturally conservative inclinations, which is I definitely feel like the minority for sure in that. I remember when Brexit happened, I was one of the only people that I knew that was even for Brexit, and that's not, again, like I don't want to, this is nothing about, people said, oh, you're all Brexiteers are racist and all this sort of thing. It's nothing necessarily to do with that. And I guess that misunderstanding is what's it caused such a division in the UK on that issue. But I found, in church over the next months and years, I would hear more about this. People would talk about the great negatives in the world, the great sort of evil forces, and you would hear these things rhymed off. Donald Trump, Brexit, all these things that are, it just always came in a sequence of things that are bad in the world. And like when you see the Trumps of the world and the Brexit happen, it posed such an issue to me in terms of, I then experienced perhaps what the people that you're talking to in your research are experiencing in terms of how political viewpoints expressed from the pulpit can actually really turn people off from their congregation. Particularly for me, it wouldn't have driven me away from my faith, but it definitely would have driven me away, from particular church events or whatever, that
Sure.
I would have thought, if certain people are speaking, if there's this event happening and there's someone speaking, I would think, oh, well, I don't know if I want to go there because it's just going to be rattled off about how people who vote the way I vote are against the church, and this is something I can definitely understand how politics from the pulpit can turn people off. I also understand how it can be an excuse in some ways. But to me, it's just very interesting how there's differing sort of viewpoints in terms of the church culture almost, that I would say over here, it's definitely very liberal, but over in America, it would be, the church is almost synonymous with conservatism. So
in some ways, except there's plenty of congregations out there that are quite liberal, that take moderate to liberal stances on a lot of things. And of course the denominational bodies themselves, depending on which ones we're talking about, tend to lean pretty liberal. There was a very large grouping of evangelical denominations actually that came out in favor of combating climate change, for instance. And they're a lot of signatories to reform immigration in a way that was a little bit more humane, and certainly wouldn't agree with the way that Donald Trump has gone on immigration. So there's a lot of different viewpoints, but you're right. At least the way that the probably public thinks about American religion is it's synonymous with conservatism. And in some ways that's a real shame, because there's a really vibrant debate that can go on amongst religious believers and others over the direction of public policy. That's
definitely what I'm seeking to provide in terms of these podcasts. I would talk to anyone from any persuasion, because I think that talking about these issues is the best way to obviously for people to learn and see where they actually, what they actually believe, what they think about, so it's definitely, it was tricky for me to have a lot kind of thrown at me. And, I wanted to talk to people from all viewpoints, so that, so there was that broad sort of reflection of all the different views that are in the church, community. But I guess where I'm going with this is, if we're thinking of the survival, I guess, of the church, when people say it's only a generation away from extinction, is more political engagement something that you believe would be harmful in terms of the church, or should the church then stay out of it more and sort of not really engage with political issues, which is more likely to drive these nuns, these people that are leaving,
No, it's a really difficult question and a thorny one. And I think that many people have come down on the side of being relevant, of staying relevant and engaging in modern culture and its problems. And I think some, and I'd probably put myself in this camp, although I'm not part of our congregation, to say that you might want to stop short of advocating for particular policies, but especially for advocating for particular candidates, that's the part that's really off-putting to many people. And trying to cross that line of political partisanship is something that almost no one can do at this point. No one's willing to change their partisan affiliation for almost any reason. So going that far is problematic. But people do want some robust engagement with a kind of orientations, values, worldviews that would help them make good decisions and decisions that they can be proud of across their life, whether it's about consumerism or political choices or personal choices. And so continue to have a robust kind of values and worldviews discussion, I think, is something that would turn many people on and not turn too many people off. But once it gets attached to a particular candidate, then it becomes problematic and probably tends to taint a lot of what they want to do in the world. So kind of
Yeah.
maintaining this is something I think that probably applies to a lot of groups, is maintaining a sense of independence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of, we're going to offer our perspective and not get tied to any other organization, maintain our distinctiveness and our mission
Mm-hmm.
in the world is probably the place to head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my opinion naturally probably would have been that, like you said, that the church would refrain from endorsements of people, endorsements of even parties in some regards. Rather, they like they support in a loose sense. For example, I would have no objection to Christian groups meeting with the prime minister and for a prayer breakfast, those kind of things, or even the president. When I see church leaders in the Oval Office, I think that to me is a positive. That's what I like to see. But what I don't like to see necessarily is them stumping for the person and saying, well, this person is who represents me, because then you get into tricky territory. If someone digs up a tweet from 5 years ago, then your whole thing collapses and you suddenly, oh, he's a
If
neo-Nazi.
hypocrisy
And
was a thing anymore, then yes.
yeah, it's just, I mean, this is the thing. People dig these things up, and then suddenly everything's tainted, and then that changes the people's view of the church. And it's all, like you said, it's very thorny, and it gets to a stage of where it's damaging, So there definitely needs to be this caution in terms of treading in that direction, in my opinion. But I think I would probably, I can understand how people like to see, at least some sort of engagement with the issues, even a mild form of lobbying. But yeah, endorsement to me, yeah, I would agree that would seem a bridge too far, in my opinion. So, I mean,
Well, and I think it extends one more step beyond that. I think, when politicians sort of transgress those values, then they probably should be called out, even if they tend to support your side, So if a left-leaning kind of religious organization sees a Democrat in the United States that suddenly makes a decision that runs counter to those values,
yeah,
they should be held to account. I mean, that's kind of the core. If those values actually matter, then you need to act on them.
yeah.
Just like any interest group or lobbying organization would do. So, I think that's part of that kind of robust kind of conversation, which I think would involve politics, but probably mandates that it keep its independence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's something you could talk about forever, and it's.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you found over your years of studying all this, the more you dig, the more you're left scratching your head, probably in a lot of cases.
Makes for a great class.
Yeah. So that's what I was actually going to talk about. How, in terms of teaching this subject, do you find, I've heard of a lot of university scholars and lecturers, especially in the US, that are now finding that the classes they're teaching, the things they're saying, they're finding they're kind of walking on eggshells a bit more. Is this something that you've experienced, in terms of the subject you're teaching being controversial? It's by its very nature. Do you find that that you're having to do that more these days?
Well, one of the benefits, I think, of teaching religion and politics is that, especially some of the many young students that I teach don't approach this with much religious skin in the game. Many of them are nuns, and they frankly don't know very much about religion. So a lot of it is new information.
That's
They
interesting.
frankly are fairly negative about religion, and so I find myself kind of taking a more religious side. I teach them about religion more rather than just talking about these issues. I have to tell them about these groups. They don't know what an evangelical is. They have some stereotypes, but they don't really know. And so I can really, kind of give them a nice baseline of information. But, some of these issues are so fun and have such ramifications for even groups and concerns that they share, that it leads them in kind of new directions. So looking at maybe this new decision that supported state funding for religious organizations, they might be able to see that as equal treatment, as not discriminating against a particular group in society. There's a number of different ways of seeing that decision, of course, but they can understand the general principles and start to develop some empathy. So it's I haven't shied away, I think, from looking at these
Yeah.
groups critically. I think, that's the way we have to go. We
Yeah, and
have to tread forward.
this is what I wonder. How much you see a lot of extreme cases being coming up on YouTube, and when you hear of people talking about how on their campus there's a lot of culture in terms of censoring what people say and how they say it, or support for particular views. I was more wondering, is that something that has come up in your establishment?
Yeah, fortunately, we haven't had those sorts of experiences.
That's
We
good.
haven't had, kind of the major protest about what a particular professor has said or that sort of thing. But but for the grace of God, go we. I'm
Yeah.
sure that could happen.
Yeah.
And I just continue to try to not push my own views about any religious group. This isn't about my opinions. This is about what the research shows, or what kind of logic. How we would work through some of these issues about, say, the Supreme Court, based on constitutional principles. So, if we stick to kind of social science methodology, I think that puts us on firm ground and allows us to be hopefully more open-minded about
Yeah.
evaluating these groups and issues.
Is that where you think the danger comes, from being opinionated rather than following, strictly the research and what the research shows, and talking about it in a more objective level? Is that, you think the danger comes more from where people start to draw their own conclusions and then, I guess, almost indoctrinate their pupils? Is that where the danger starts to come from?
I think so.
Yeah.
You frankly don't see too many of these debates really coming from the social sciences and the sciences. Those that stick to a methodology where they can kind of point to the data and about their conclusions, have a firmer foundation, or get a more open-minded kind of view than someone who's saying like so and so is a Nazi or whatever.
Yeah. I would be worried, I think, if I was a lecturer, just by, especially in America, because you wonder, when will the day come when someone digs up something about, is there, it just seems to be,
there's no doubt.
Yeah, it seems like it's promoted these days. I heard some crazy stuff about some college campuses having posters down the corridors, kind of like hotlines you can ring to report your lecturer, and this is something that it's troubling to me to hear that this is going on.
Yeah, well, especially now that a lot of our classes have gone online.
Right, yes.
More of our classes are being put online, and anybody can see them, and that means that you can take any line out of context and do whatever you want with them. So that's been more of a danger, I think, and a worry that perhaps our open lines of communication, our free open dialogue is going to be impinged because there's sort of too much public scrutiny. But I certainly haven't gotten much at all about that kind of treatment from my students. I mean, I think we're all pretty much open to debate pretty much everything, which is great.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you just hope that all campuses could be like, people acting like grown adults, really. I guess it's a lot to ask almost in some regards, but the world's kind of going a different
I think most of them are. I mean, these are pretty isolated incidents that you hear, so
well, this is what I wanted to get your perspective on. Is it a widespread issue, or is this something that is more isolated? But it's good to hear that that's not something that's made its way into your world just yet.
Yeah, that's right. And there's actually been some more systematic research that looks at this and really doesn't find any evidence of indoctrination. Students aren't, if they're getting more liberal across 4 years, it's because they're associating with more liberal students that they haven't been exposed to before. So you'll find students kind of going more conservative if they happen to be hanging out with more conservative students. It's more, of course, about peer pressure, of course, than it is about us. We want our students to read the syllabus, and we're pretty happy if that happens. So, it's not too surprising that what we say doesn't matter that much.
Yeah.
But most of us just we're not in the ball game of trying to change our students' political positions. That's just not, even for a political scientist, that's not what I'm about. I'm about, teaching them to evaluate things in a critical way according to a particular methodology and learning about the way the political system works. And that's not a partisan game.
Yeah. It's interesting to get your perspective on that. Finally, I was going to ask you just, I heard or I read about this shift, I guess, coming back to more of your research kind of topics, but I read that there's more evangelicals and Christians these days that would identify in terms of some topics as permissive of things, but still against. So I guess it's something that is more common these days than it used to be. It used to be you weren't permissive and you were against it, you know. But is this something that's more common these days, where people are, if you take the example of gay marriage, people are saying, well, that's up to them, they want to do that, but I'm not for it, but I'll allow them to do it. Is this a more reasonable perhaps concession that the church can give, this kind of attitude of being permissive of things that they disagree with? Or is this something that perhaps is then further diluting the church message?
Yeah, that's a really great question. This is brand new research that we've been doing that looks at this kind of gap. Do you support the rights, for instance, like you said, of LGBT Americans to same-sex marriage, but maybe you don't support homosexual sexual relations, and there is a gap there, and more likely to support the right than they are the relations. You know, and you could see that as a dilution of the message, but it's kind of a core American ideal of sort of live and let live. So at least for American democracy, there's one hopeful sign that I've seen lately, and this is perhaps one of them, is that there has been this broad right to equal treatment with regard to marriage, and now in job discrimination. And people seem committed to that, even if they don't necessarily like the group. This is what political tolerance is. This is the way that you have a democracy, is you extend equal rights even to groups that you dislike. So, you know, yes, it probably does dilute the church's message a little bit, but the church has changed on a lot of different positions. And in fact, we just found the other day that there's a vast majority of evangelicals that support women being clergy. This is not something. There's a vast majority of Catholics that support women being clergy. This is something where the church has changed. Churches have changed dramatically across time. There were at one point, you know, African Americans weren't allowed to be members of a number of churches, and of course, racial equality is something that all American churches, for the most part, would support. And so, you know, the church continues to adapt with culture over time. And it's, you know, not necessarily an easy conversation, but one that actually does take place, and there is change. So, you know, it's a challenging conversation, but I keep coming back to what's the benefit for democracy. And at least here we see a really hopeful sign that maybe this one element of tension in our politics might get resolved.
And the reason I think this probably jumped out at me, I think I saw it on a little widget somewhere. It was like a Twitter feed. The reason it jumps out at me is because I don't know, I wouldn't expect you to be familiar with Northern Irish politics in terms of, in the UK, you know, we have a devolved government in terms of Northern Ireland, you know, having their own, it's almost like a state government, I guess. But we are the party that has been the dominant party in Northern Irish politics, has been one that the DUP, they're called, which is firmly a religious party. So they, for example, if I vote for the DUP, people are voting for them because of their unionist perspective in terms of Northern Ireland remaining in the United Kingdom. That's why people are voting for the DUP. But when you vote for them, you're really voting as well for quite a hardline stance on their anti same-sex marriage, anti-abortion, anti basically anything that's not from Christian, you know, ideals or policies that don't conform to their particular Christian views. And I guess it was interesting to me that as a Christian in Northern Ireland, to me, the most reasonable point of view would have been to allow these things to happen, but not condone them, perhaps in your personal Christian walk. And this is something for a party that's so integrated in terms of religious viewpoints and politics, you know, it's interesting to see. I just wondered, are they doing more harm than good to their, I guess, both to their party and their faith by just being so hardline and not allowing things that don't conform to your religion? I always thought they were doing more harm by just battering on and saying, no, you can't get married, you can't do this, because people have voted us in because these are linked in, you know, they're voting for us for a different reason, but really, you know, it's all in the manifesto. So I guess they have no reason to complain. But I just wondered, is it doing more harm than good for them to keep going on about it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So my general reaction would be that that Protestants in Northern Ireland are under a great deal of pressure, and there's value for the party in trying to keep a separation with the other side, and so you can do that on a number of different lines, and they could overlap with an economic line, they could or overlap with a social line or a religious line, and here it's kind of probably has all three. And so maintaining these barriers between your group and the other side prevents this sort of dilution of ideas. And, you're going to support us because everything is at stake. Your moral values are at stake and your social
it's a
ties
package
are at
deal.
stake. Yeah, package deal, right? And so, when you start to kind of tinker on the lines here and be sort of more libertarian and say, you can take whatever position you want on abortion or marriage or what have you. Maybe you start to consider the other side and think it wouldn't matter so much if the other side was in power.
Yeah, I understand the hesitancy to abortion in terms of, I guess, your perspective on whether that baby, that fetus, is a human being. I can understand how that would be something that people, I suppose, rightly, if they believe it's a person, should be more resistant to changing. In terms of same-sex marriage, if you were to say to someone you voted for the DUP, now bear in mind they're the majority party, if you were to say that you voted for the DUP, the first thing people would think is probably you're a homophobe or something, you're some kind of bigot. And I just always thought, isn't that a shame where the majority of people are really being apologetic for a viewpoint that they probably really don't care that much on. And a lot of Christians here, I guess it's a particular branch of a particular denomination that is steering that party, but a lot of people probably would be hesitant to change that from being a policy to being an opinion. But I guess my perspective always was that people will have a more favorable view on your faith if you were to take hands off the political or the state, and just keep it as something that, rightfully the church shouldn't have to condone it, but in terms of like legally and the state shouldn't have any restriction on things that aren't harming other people, and that's that to me, it's just interesting that topic came up because that's something that's really relevant in Northern Irish culture.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult situation. I think, if there was less pressure on the party system to maintain those kind of really tight boundaries, you'd see a lot more fluidity here and a lot more kind of social change. But I think that continued, we need to keep this together because that's the only thing holding the unionist kind of perspective together. There's a lot of different views on this, but that's my best guess about
it's
what's
the separation of church and state issue, really. And I was saying actually in the previous person I was talking to about how it's interesting that America is designed for there to be a separation of church and state, but just how intermingled everything is. Religion is so intermingled with their politics, and it's the same here. We don't have that built in, but almost in the UK, I would say, even though the Queen is the head of the church, that it's almost becoming more and more secular. And it's interesting that America, being very pro separation of church and state, it's almost becoming more and more integrated. So
opposite direction. Yeah. Some people would say it's because of the free market.
Yeah, that's a conversation probably for another day.
yeah, in some ways, that's right.
Yeah. No, I think I've taken up a lot of your time, and I just really appreciate you coming and just chatting through these issues.
Of course,
it's been
pleasure,
great,
Josh.
No, it's been great to have you on, and just I think it's just really helpful. I guess a lot of this research is coming from a secular perspective, but it's objective. It's not steeped in opinion. It's interesting for me as a Christian and for people who may be watching from a church background to get insights into what is turning people off, what helps bring people in, what is helpful, what should we need, what do we look out for, I think that's a really helpful self-critique of, we should be looking and reflecting on, is what we're doing reflecting us and our faith well, or are we actually doing more harm than good? And that, I guess that's why I wanted to have you on to sort of talk through these things. If you have any parting comments or wisdom, if you were someone that was steering religious people in the future, what, from all your research, what would you say is something that the church should watch out for that's actually perhaps doing more harm than good? You know, something that maybe the church is supporting, or even American evangelicals, or things that they're doing that they might be thinking they're doing, like, you know, they're doing the right thing by supporting this, but actually they're doing more harm.
Yeah, that's a really, it's continued to be a really long conversation and a difficult one. You know, and in some ways it's sort of not the goal of my research to kind of help religion do its job better. You know, I kind of approach this
That's
from
fair.
how do we make democracy better, and what are the sort of barriers to continuing these amazing institutions that we've developed over this past several hundred years. But I think, you know, there is some value in pluralism, quite a bit of value in pluralism, of having these different perspectives be vibrant and robust in public debate. And the more that they get, like, to go back to part of the conversation we had, the more that they get attached to specific parties and personalities does a great disservice to democratic deliberation. So maintaining that distinctiveness and holding firm to a set of values that people can understand and respect is probably the best approach.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Paul Djupe. It's been great talking to you. And if is there anything, you're on Twitter, do you want to
Paul
quickly
Djupe?
plug Paul Djupe on Twitter, and people can check out your work if they want to see more.
ReligionInPublic.blog is where a lot of these views get expressed, a lot of our research get expressed.
And it's a great blog. I've been sort of dipping in and out to find things to talk about. So I encourage everyone to check that out, especially if you're interested in this. But yeah, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much. And thanks for watching, everyone who's joined in.